We're deeply thankful that Dr. Finnian O'Cionnaith is present tonight to deliver the annual David Chart talk in this, the year of the centenary of PRONI 100. Dr. O'Cionnaith has proven himself in a series of publications and public talks since 2010, a worthy successor to historical geographers of the eminence of J.H. Andrews, Willie Nolan, P.J. Duffy and others.
And good evening, everybody. Thank you all very much for being here. My name is Dr. Finnian O'Cionnaith. As Des was saying, I am a land surveyor. I went through DIT in Dublin, land surveying program, and I still work in the cartographic industry, though mostly now in digital mapping. But my primary academic interest has always been on the history of my industry, and particularly the history of it prior to the foundation of the Ordnance Survey. I received a PhD in history from Maynooth in 2011, and I've written a couple of books since on this subject. My presentation today is titled 18th Century Property Mapping, a window on early modern Ireland. And we'll be looking at a wide variety of maps to explore this topic, many of which are held by the Public Records Office. And I very much hope you enjoy. The genesis of this presentation comes from a book I wrote last year titled Land Surveying in Ireland 1690 to 1830, which was kindly sponsored by the Society of Chartered Surveyors and published by Four Courts Press. This evening's presentation explores a topic that transcends nearly every chapter in the book, namely how property mapping can be used to understand 18th century in Ireland and also expose the work of land surveyors. To accomplish this goal, we'll first take a short look at the history of Ireland's estate landscape and those who live there. Our main focus will be on the 18th century, which was a particularly dynamic era in estate mapping. We will see who were the main employers of surveyors and what information they sought from their land. Importantly, we'll also see how these demands shape the cartographic record we've been left and the subsequent impact the estate landscape played in driving surveying capability in Ireland. And as I like to say, a lot of people look at maps and ask questions of them, as in they seek information from them about the world. I like to throw it on its head, and I like to see how the world shaped the maps we have. Because ultimately someone pays for a map to be made, and if we can understand their motivations, we can understand the maps that we see. So part one is Ireland's estate landscape. It's an often repeated, though overstated adage that during the past 500 years, Ireland has been one of the most mapped places in the world. Despite its small size, the island has indeed undergone frequent nationwide surveys, the majority of those before 1922 linked to policies emanating from neighbouring Britain. The relationships between land measurement, mapping and governance in the Irish context is therefore long and multifaceted, greatly shaped by what information was required from the landscape at any given time. Ireland's main economic output during the 18th century was agriculture, with most farming land formed into a patchwork of large privately owned holdings known as estates. Most of the population worked the land as tenant farmers, occupying leases from the landed social class known as the Protestant ascendancy. The ascendancy held near total economic and political power during this age, gaining much of their income either directly from agricultural output of their lands or the rents they charged tenants. So in this respect, they were like the industrialists of the 19th and 20th centuries, or even the tech barons you see today regards money. One of the clearest ways of understanding what information this group saw from their lands, how they managed their estates, and how this in turn impacted their power over the wider population base is by examining period property mapping. Surprisingly, there was no government-controlled mapping agency responsible for general or property information during the period. The Ordnance Survey did not arrive in Ireland until the 1820s, the country's spatial needs instead being met by an eclectic group of commercial surveyors. As such, we are not left with a uniform series of maps from this era, but instead thousands of manuscripts drawn in different styles and compiled using different methods, each individual map being a historical snapshot of a defined geographical area. However, when considered as an island-wide, multi-decade collective, there are a number of trends visible within these documents, providing unmatched insight into the complex estate landscape that dominated Irish economic life. In this manner, they are of immense value to researchers studying of a wide variety of subjects. And first, a little bit the timeline that we're looking at. It's the central period just here in blue. The period in question is often known as the long 18th century, stretching from around the time of the Battle of the Boyne in 1690 until the end of the Napoleonic Wars in the 1810s. Within the timeline of land surveying, it falls between the final punitive land forfeitures of the early 1700s and ends with the arrival of the Ordnance Survey in the 1820s. Lasting just over a century, this interim period saw no acts of Parliament dictating the work of surveyors, nor supreme national authority to which they reported. Surveyors, in effect, were left to their own instruments, both literally and figuratively, to service the land market. In many ways, it was the golden era of freelance commercial surveying. During this time, Ireland was still considered a separate kingdom to Britain, with its own parliament based in College Green in Dublin. It was, however, joined in personal union with the British monarchy, namely the House of Hanover, though Irish politicians were keen to defend their local autonomy as much as possible from interference from Westminster. This Irish political group was dominated by those who had benefited most from the conquest of Catholic and Gaelic lands in the previous century and were known as the Protestant Ascendancy. During the early 18th century, this elite social group had coalesced into a distinct state-owning class, excluding the Roman Catholic majority, but also other Protestant dominations such as Presbyterians or fellow members of the Church of Ireland who were too poor to hold land and thus vote. Such was the extent of the ascendancy's power that by the end of the 18th century, they comprised of less than 0.5% of the population, but owned 95% of land. As estates were the primary source of their wealth, surveys became a key source of information on their value and how they were managed. Property maps thus becoming of direct relevance to the national economy. Consequently, the needs of this key client base directly influenced the production of maps and work of land surveyors. Many of the ascendancy chose to run their estates remotely with little day-to-day interest in their tenants or lands apart from the income they provided, the role of the absentee landlord holding particular significance and vilification in Irish history. This absence therefore increased the surveyor's importance within Ireland's economic system, becoming the landlord's witness on the ground and their surveys developing into a form of geographic auditing. Through this process, an estate owner could gain great insight into the extent of their holdings, their tenants, and the overall health of their income without ever having to actually visit their lands. Estates could range in size from hundreds to tens of thousands of acres, sometimes scattered across several counties. The focal point of most lay in the often palatial residence of the lord, known colloquially as the big house. Surrounding this building was usually a domain or parkland for the landlord's personal use, with larger estates containing villages or planned towns where markets were held. Farmland outside of the domain could either be one continuous swathe or grouped into isolated holdings, the lord often nominating an agent to do the day-to-day management, such as organise tenants or administer rent collection. These estate officers would in turn call upon the assistance of land surveyors, with their maps and measurements providing key information to aid decision-making on the ground. It should be noted, however, that surveyors were not enthralled to the ascendancy or their agents. The commercial nature of their work meant that surveyors could be hired directly by tenant farmers. This helped the profession shed its earlier association with the conquest of Ireland, with tenants using a surveyor's measurement to confirm that they were paying the correct rent based on acreage or help enforce their rights regarding occupation. Consequently, the 18th century land surveyor became a relatively neutral specialist, avoiding the long-term stigma in the Irish psyche gained by other estate management roles like agents or bailiffs. Conversely, this neutrality decreased levels of attention paid to surveyors by period commentators, being infrequently featured in media or rarely denoted in art or literature. As a result, they were an ever-present part of agrarian life, who seldom drew serious attention from wider society. And this is a lovely little estate map from the Downshire holdings in the Public Records Office. And many of you will be familiar with Ordnance Survey mapping. And when you look at this map, there's a distinct difference. The main feature here are boundaries, field numbers, tenant names. You can see number 14 there, William Stewart, number 15 in field 15, James Smith, and the acreage below in acres, roods, and perches. So this is an economic map. This isn't you can locate things, but really it's showing an economic landscape. Given this scenario, how did estates help shape the role of surveyors and the use of their maps? Estates invariably became a mainstay for surveyors, given their prominence in the landscape and the potential revenue they could provide from both tenants and landlords. The profession's interests in the measurement of property, as opposed to the measurement of land in general, meant that land surveyors were attuned to proprietal concepts important to these clients, such as boundaries, which automatically inferred possession, control, and exclusion. To exercise these legal rights, a landowner or tenant required an accurate understanding of where their property began and ended, thus requiring the specialist services of a surveyor. As a result, the profession's core continually adjusted their skills and techniques based on the needs of estate economics. The resulting cartographic output differed widely and was dependent on the scope and requirements of clients, alongside the capability of individual land surveyors. Cadastral property maps were by far the most numerous, inhabiting the lower end of the aesthetic spectrum, though they are of greatest practical and legal use for state management. And we'll see a few examples coming up. These simple maps listed field areas, valuation assessments for rents, tenants' names and boundaries, reflecting the countryside with clinical, though uninspired efficiency. At the opposite end of this aesthetic range were estate atlases or prestige surveys created for lords rather than tenants. These works became more prevalent during the latter half of the century as art and surveying became greater integrated. The primary importance of this latter type of map was to influence and impress rather than for daily estate management. Taking pride of place in drawing rooms and libraries in Dublin and London, these decorative manuscript maps became extensions of a landowner's taste, cultural aspirations, and even sometimes their sense of self. Most remaining estate surveys fell along this cadastral and prestige scale based on the money a patron was willing to invest, the final use of the map, and of course, the inherent skill of the surveyor or draftsman. Now, I can talk on and on and on about what is involved in an estate map, but I thought we're going to use an example from the Public Records Office. It was featured on their Twitter page a couple of weeks ago, and together we're going to explore this map. And hopefully, if you're involved in local studies or history studies, this will help you get really good info out of a map, because really there are only a few key components of a property map that you can look at, and everything else is a variation on that. So this is a map of the townland of Tullyhew, part of the estate of Robert Bernard Sparrow, situate in the county of Armagh, and it was surveyed in March 1800 by John Benn. I've never been here. I know it's near Banbridge. I've never been here. First time I saw the map was a couple of weeks ago, but we're going to explore this townland of Tullyhew and see what we can get from this map. One of the first things that jumps out at you is its cartouche. It's this lovely drawing, a sketch, relatively well executed for the time. Yeah, John Benn did a pretty good job at it. Better than I could. And shows two men out fishing. They've got a donkey with them. So issues like this or maps, cartouches like this were included. Sometimes it could be very humorous, putty involved in various whimsical activities. This one is just a picture. It might have been something that the surveyor encountered. There is a story to this, I'm sure, but it gives a little insight to it. But the real good information is in the title. We know this is the townland of Tullyhew. We know the landowner, Robert Bernard Sparrow, and we know who surveyed it. So there's some key pieces of information. And landowners would often keep surveyors on for many, many years. So like they would have their accountant or their secretary. The surveyor became part of their staff consultant. So that's some good information. We know who the landowner was in this area. Next feature that stands out is this large rectangular box. And this is of key importance. This is a list of all the landholders that rented land from Mr. Sparrow. We can see their names listed, John Makey to start with. There's also to the left of that a field number, an index. So each field on the map is numbered and we can see who has which field. And at the top you have acres, roods, and perches. And it's a list of the total area then that each tenant would own, and this would be used to calculate their rent. So we're going to take an example on this. We're looking at field number 22 that was rented to Robert Bennett, and he had 3 acres, 1 rood, and 33 perches of land. And we can identify the field. There's field number 22. We get an idea. So straight away, if you are interested in local history in this particular part of the townland Tullyhue, you've good information on what's going on. You know who occupies that field, you know who that person rents from, and you know the area of that field. A lot of other ancillary information across this map that can be useful. You can see this cruciform mark along the outside of the survey. This is a mark that indicates where 2 neighboring properties meet. So the left of that mark is one person's land, to the other side is another person's. So where the mark meets the boundary of Tullyhue, that's where 3 separate properties meet. So if there is an issue with a boundary, you know which neighboring landlord to talk to. You'll also notice there's no background mapping. A neighboring landowner will not let you on their land to make a survey because they didn't hire you. They don't want to give up information on their land. So property surveys of this era tend to exist in a bit of a cartographic void. There was no Ordnance Survey, there was no background mapping they could do. So really you'd only get a map of your own property. We also have a lovely north arrow here, quite decorative. Again, this surveyor had a bit of art training. You're going to see some examples later of surveyors who didn't have art training, but I just wanted to start you off with a nice example. This would have been hand drawn. Some of them used prints as well, but lovely, lovely sort of Rococo design. And then we have information on height, even though there's no contours. You can actually see there's a bit of a hill shading there running through field 29 and 30, crossing the road, bit of field shading. And we also have a lovely little bridge there. Gives us idea of infrastructure. I know a lot of people are interested in historic infrastructure projects, so we know there's a bridge. Fields rarely change. They're quite time invariant, so it was actually quite easy to identify where this townland was and to orientate it on modern aerial photography. To the top right-hand corner, that's the Newry Canal and also the railway through it. Of course, the railway is not on the 1800 map, and the town nearby has grown since. But a lot of the fields are very easy to identify in modern aerial photography. So again, these historic maps can be very useful for very small areas and give you great information in return. And when we compare them, we can get some information. We see Robert Bennett's field again, circled in red, number 22. We can see the field's actually been divided in 2. It's this, overlaid the original map on the aerial photography. The field's been split in 2, and there is some sort of structure, like a house or a barn, on its southeast side. And we can see in field 25 now, next to it, there's actually a small little housing estate. So that's different. And the bridge we noticed earlier, thanks to Street View things such as Google, we can actually drop ourselves in there and we can see that that bridge is actually still there. And the high ground I mentioned is actually visible in the background of that image. So again, that's a lot of information we can tie in from historical sources and modern sources and create a very good picture of what was happening on the ground. So ladies and gentlemen, that is the townland of Tullyhue. I've never visited it, but together we now know more of it, and you can take these aspects and apply them to any property mapping that you may want to study yourself, and I hope that's of use. So part 3 of our journey is schools of surveying and how that reflected in property mapping. Within 18th century estate mapping, there emerged several schools of cartographic practice based on a number of different factors. Most common was the Irish school, based on practical though unsophisticated cartographic style, and which remained prevalent throughout the century. By the 1750s, a second school emerged known as the French school. This latter movement became an immediate success with elite members of the ascendancy and eventually cornered much of the high-end estate market. The Irish school was based on traditional survey methods that had been practiced since the days of the forfeiture surveys of the 17th century. It was noticeable for its simple style, basic decoration, and limited realism. Maps often devoted to boundary lines with little interest in the contents of properties. It was not unique to Ireland. book could be found in Britain, France, and North America, the term Irish school being useful within the Irish context to differentiate it from later styles. One of the leading members of this school in the early part of the century was Gabriel Stokes, pictured here, and he was also featured prominently in my book. And this is one of the very few portraits we have of an 18th century Irish surveyor. He had begun his career in the 1690s under the tutelage of prominent estate surveyor Joseph Moreland, and had spent his apprenticeship measuring the holdings of the Archbishop of Dublin and Trinity College. By the 1720s, he had emerged as a leading estate land surveyor in Leinster, and also gained renown for being the first survey instrument maker of note in Ireland. By the 1740s, he had been appointed Deputy Surveyor General of Ireland, responsible for the measurement of Crown lands across the island. His prominence within the Irish school makes his maps of note. This 1722 map of Shankill, County Dublin, is a typical example of the Irish style. This is Shankill, South County Dublin. You can see a very detailed property boundary. That's about all you can see. Within it, he has written, this area includes mountains, contains 714 acres of plantation measure. So we have details on the property bounds. You can see those cruciform marks around the outside, indicating where neighboring properties bounded each other. But that's about it. We can see a few structures, no information on fields, anything like that. This is a very basic property survey. Now, his cartouche stands in absolute mirror image, or the total opposite end of the design spectrum compared to the cartographic information. And Stokes would use a stamp for this. Stamp the map. He had his limitations. He knew them. And he would write in the details within the blank area. So, and the same with the north arrow as well. So this was a typical example of a basic Irish style early century map. Such simplicity was linked to the dominance of early forfeiture maps on the psyche of both clients and surveyors. In the first half of the 18th century, most clients were satisfied to receive such maps as they had become used to them. Of great influence on this situation was the Down Survey of the 1650s, completed in the wake of Cromwell's campaign. The Down Survey simple style influenced client expectations of property mapping well into the 18th century, doing much to limit artistic innovation within the surveying community. And we have a little extract from a newspaper here showing the influence of the Down Survey even up until the 1790s. This is from a Belfast newspaper, and it is a reference written by the Deputy Surveyor General of the time, Mr. Hancock, and this is for a surveyor, John Wilson of Bangor, County Down. He had been well trained in mathematics and also from tracing of the Down or other surveys in any degree of proportion with exactness. He is therefore sufficiently skilled to practice as a land surveyor. So the Down Survey, even though it was made in the 1650s, still had influence right up till the Ordnance Survey became available. One of the primary reasons for the endurance of the Irish school lay in professional training. Prior to the 1750s, this training mostly related to mathematics with little attention paid to art. Property maps were intended to be technical documents contributing to estate management, this ethos thus dominating surveyors' education. This 1695 map by surveyor Owen Swan highlights this point, the sparse detail of the spatial element offset by the ornate compass rose. Despite the accuracy of his measurements, he simply did not have the training to expand geographic detail far beyond the map's basic cadastral format. Such style was also applied to urban surveys. The 1700 plot of land on Christchurch Lane in Dublin City by Gabriel Stokes, who we had just seen, exists as an irregular polygon lost in a cartographic void. Despite such simplicity, Stokes's maps were, however, clear and accurate. Others fared less well in their execution. Case in point is this 1716 map by Sligo-based surveyor Brian Crilly, indicative of the lack of art training that existed at the time for surveyors. The accuracy of his spatial work degraded by its poor application on the map. It's an ugly map. His work is probably excellent, but this is an ugly map and it takes away from it. By the mid-decades of the century, the Ascendancy were in search of something new from their estate maps. They wanted maps of their lands to duplicate their taste in art, furniture, clothing, and architecture, most of which were heavily influenced by trends emerging from France. The older, heavy Baroque styles were giving way to the more natural feel of a newer trend called Rococo. As we've seen, art had never been a strong suit of the local surveying profession. An exterior force was therefore required to meet these new consumer demands, culminating in the French School of Surveying. In this manner, Irish estate mapping found itself radically changed by wider trends in 18th century society. The founder of the French school was a French Huguenot immigrant called Jean Roch, who had built a successful surveying firm in London in the 1730s and 40s. He specialized in applying the latest Rococo fashions to mapping. His plans of several major European capitals, earning him renown as well as gaining him the position of official cartographer to the Prince of Wales. In the early 1750s, he relocated to Dublin with the purpose of producing maps for several Irish cities. His French style of mapping soon became much in demand from the elite of the Ascendancy, with Roch's apprentices finding extensive opportunities in Ireland over the rest of the century. In comparison to the Irish school, Roch's new methods were instantly recognizable. Decoratively, patrons could expect ornate topographic plans incorporating cutting edge of Rococo adornment, scallop shell cartouches, vignettes of local vistas, or putty engaged in a wide variety of rural activities, as we see on this one. Estate maps were topographically intricate, buildings presented in uniform planimetric fashion, and fields realistically colored and shaded dependent on their use. In this manner, these maps were practical documents for estate management as well as being visually attractive. Along with their obvious aesthetic qualities, adherents to the French school were also keen proponents of trigonometric techniques, which, despite the added effort, resulted in highly accurate measurements. Roch's services were the best money could buy, leaving the older Irish school looking outdated, overly simplistic, and out of touch with high-end consumer demand. Any surveyor could produce a cadastral map, but it was rare to find one who could incorporate the latest artistic fashions, apply watercolors with finesse, and add subtle topographic features to a paper map. The requirements of this high-end work began to differentiate dedicated estate surveyors from the general population of the industry, again driven by the needs of the ascendancy, with, as a rule, the most talented surveyor attracting the wealthiest clients. And we have a lovely example here from surveyor Samuel Byron, and we saw how earlier Stokes had used a stamp on his map for his cartouche, some decorations, whereas he has hand-drawn in these lovely, lovely sheep here and trees. Just little touches. This is another example of how detail began to appear in maps from mid-century onward. If any of you know Dublin, this is the Dundrum area going up to the Dublin Hills. It's very close to that map that we saw Stokes, was big empty map just with no detail. But here we can see that to the left of the map, there's a lot of hills into the mountains and then down into farmland. So we get a much better idea of what's going on topographically from these later era maps. The French school were also very skilled at prints, and we have an example here from Roch's direct apprentice Bernard Scally of his Hibernian Atlas of County Survey. So as the French school continued, estate maps became less, or printed maps became less and less common, but estate maps continued as a mainstay. Proof of how estate maps were created is plentiful if the reader knows what to look for. Most period clients were not overly interested in the methods or instruments used by surveyors, so direct evidence is often difficult to spot. In mapping, such technicalities are, however, of historical interest and add to the efforts made at the time to accurately record the estate landscape. The most obvious assistance in this task is period technical literature. These manuals played a pivotal role in educating surveyors and gave advice ranging from how to operate instruments, what mathematical formula to use when working in the field, and sometimes even what clothing to wear. Prior to the 1750s, most manuals came from England, with books such as John Wing's The Art of Surveying and William Laybourne's The Complete Surveyor, both pictured here, proving immensely successful. In 1752, Irish surveyor Robert Gibson wrote his seminal Treatises of Practical Surveying, with central image there. The first book specifically written for an Irish audience, which was eventually republished 22 times over a 90-year period and proved very successful in North America. 2 US presidents owned a copy of that book. Surveying manuals were a direct reflection of the information needed by clients, thus exposing further light on what landowners wanted from their surveyors and how the profession moved to meet such demands. Manuals also provided direct evidence on instruments, with authors recommending which devices should be used for various circumstances. There were 2 primary instrument categories within any surveyor's arsenal, those that measured distances and those that measured angles. The primary option available for distance measurement was a decimalized chain, known as a surveyor's or Gunther's chain. These were simple devices consisting of a series of metal links with brass handles at either end, the surveyor counting how many chains lay between the start and end of their measurement line. Popular angular devices included the theodolite and circumferenter, tripod-mounted apparatus consisting of optical sights and a 12-inch horizontal circle divided into degrees and minutes. A plethora of specialized instruments was also utilized for specific tasks when the need arose. And while rare, we can actually see examples of this in mapping. This is a cartouche from a survey by Robert Gibson. And we can actually see the putty either side are holding chains. It's very rare to see that. And also a bit more in your face is this a vignette from a city survey of Dublin by Thomas Sheridan, 1801, and we can actually see a surveyor's level included in the map. Another excellent example is when you have a double north arrow in a map. It's a good sign that a circumferenter was being used, also known as a surveyor's compass. And this would take its bearings from magnetic north. So what a surveyor would do on the double north arrow in the top right-hand corner, we see the vertical arrow is true north, and the arrow inclined to the right is the magnetic north, because magnetic north changes year on year. So you can tell that this surveyor was taking magnetic north into account when they made their survey, which is a big sign that they were using a surveyor's compass or circumferenter while conducting this work. And again, we can actually see that in that example we were looking at earlier, that the map is slightly skewed, indicating that our surveyor may have used a circumferenter in the course of his work. It's a good sign. It's not indicated in his north arrow, but the fact that it isn't really lined up with magnetic or with true north is a good hint that a circumferenter or magnetic bearings were used. Once the surveyor had selected their preferred instrument, their next task was to divide the area in question into a series of regular geometric shapes whose areas could then be easily calculated. Draft maps thus become useful guides in understanding the compilation process. Lacking the refinement of the finished versions handed to clients, these draft documents regularly contained information for the surveyor's eyes only and highlighted their efforts in cleaning up raw data to create a polished client copy. And we see side-by-side copies here of the same map. Some text has changed location, obviously design decisions have been made, but you can often find some pieces of information on a draft that may not have made it on to the final map. So in summary, historical property maps are of significant historical importance for day-to-day property usage and estate management. Lots of information. If you know how to read them, if you know how to extract it, it can really, really help your understanding on an area in history. Few alternative sources. There was no Ordnance Survey, so a lot of pre-ordnance history was dependent on the private profession. It gives us a great insight on the economic foundation of the Protestant ascendancy and the daily lives of tenants. So we can get a lot of information about the lives of people at the time, the infrastructure they live with, roads, bridges, and whatnot. It gives us a great idea of life at that period. And there's not just one type of estate map, as we've seen: Irish school, French schools, cadastrals, prestige survey. So there's a big range, and I hope to have shown you a good selection so it helps your understanding. Client demands changed. people move with the times, fashions changed, demands changed, information changed, and the surveyors needed to keep up with that to make sure that their client base got what they wanted and will continue to pay them to gather that information, because ultimately somebody pays for a map, and it is that's it. Surveyors don't just wake up in the morning and feel inspired. We're not artists. We need to be paid to do it, and we need to meet those client demands. So maps help us understand what those client demands are. And as we've seen, maps really are the tip of the iceberg. There was most of the icebergs below the water. That's the training the surveyor received in art, in mathematics, in the techniques, in using their instruments, maintaining their instruments, maintaining relationships with clients. So what we see is just the final 10% of the effort surveyors put in actually creating those maps. And it's it just shows the effort and the impacts land surveying profession has had on the history of this island. So thank you all very much.